Hey everybody, my name is Derek McGill. I'm the Vice President of YAL. Now, when I was setting up this event with the rest of our members, I got a lot of questions from people on campus who said, don't you feel unsafe about getting a gun away on campus? Don't you feel worried that someone's going to shoot the school up? But the reality is, it's people like you that are here today that make me feel safe. It's people like you who are willing to stand for our moral right to self-defense that make me feel safe. And leading into that, I just wanted to say that we can make the moral argument all we want. We can talk the philosophy all we want. With absolute conviction, we can say we are in the moral right. But we need more than that to combat what we're facing right now. We need facts to back up the moral argument. We need statistics and knowledge of what gun crime and what gun control and how gun control affects gun crime. And so that's why we brought John Lott today. John Lott is the author of 7 books. His recent is At the Brink, Will Obama Push Us Over the Edge. He's also the author of over 100 academic articles, and he's written books including Freedonomics and the title of this event, More Guns, Less Crime. John is an economist as well as a Fox News commentator, and he's he definitely is the best voice in the country, if not the world, on gun control, gun crime, gun rights. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Lott.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I appreciate you all setting up. You obviously put a lot of work into putting this together, and I appreciate this. Standing room only. We have 2 seats in the front if you guys. Somebody wants to go down here. So, you probably couldn't have timed this better in terms of what's going on in Washington, D.C. In fact, I have to confess, I kind of wish we picked a different day right now to have done this. But I guess tomorrow we'll be having a cloture vote on whether or not to continue the debate on the new rules. And I'm happy. I could go into more on what's actually in the bill, particularly in the question period, but I was asked just to give kind of a general overview right now about the issue of guns and crime. And so there's one question I'd like you to think about, and that is, can you name me one place in the world where we have crime data both before and after a gun ban has been put in place, where a ban on guns, either all handguns or all guns, has seen a drop in murder rates? Because I can't find them. Every place that we have crime data for that you see this change, murder rates go up, and they often go up by very large amounts. Now, Americans have had some experience with gun-free zones. We've seen this in places like Washington, D.C., and Chicago. People, I think, at least generally understand that murder rates and violent crime rates went up in both of those places after the bans were put in place. They may not know how much they went up. But, often the proponents of those types of bans will say, well, those really weren't fair tests. Because unless you go and you ban guns every place in a country, you can't really expect the ban to work, is their argument. So, they'll say they can go and get guns from Maryland and Virginia, or they can go and get guns from the rest of Illinois. I suppose I have a couple problems with that. One is, I'm not really sure how that explains why murder rates go up. I can understand why that might explain why they don't go down as much as they say, they may have been expecting them to go down. Also, the thing is, it's just not Washington, D.C. and Chicago. You can look around the world. We have lots of whole countries that have, or at least a number of them have adopted gun bans. And yet, every time we look at it, murder rates and violent crime rates have gone up. And it's not just regular nations. We have island nations, which you would think would be kind of the perfect experiment for these guys, because there's no neighbor that they can go and blame. Well-defined, easily defendable, and monitored borders. And yet what you see in those cases is you still see these increases in murder rates and violent crime rates after the bans have been put in place. And I suppose in many cases it would have been nice when they passed these laws if they kind of warned everybody that they didn't expect them to work. But I guess you can only expect so much. Now, I just make a general comment about the gun debate because it's something I've run into time after time, and that is hypothetical arguments about what things might possibly go wrong if we allow citizens to be able to go and own guns. Because it's rarely based on facts. And what I find usually is that people just assume whatever the laws are right now, that's the way they've always been, and that's often not the case. I'll just give you a couple examples. After 9/11, I was asked by several airline pilots unions to go and help them when they were trying to be able to go and carry guns with them on planes. And you may remember at least some of the discussion. I remember hearing one senator that I was in front of say, well, what happens if you have two pilots on the plane, both of them have guns, they get into an argument in the cockpit, both of them pull it out, and they fire, and then they're both dead. What are you going to do with this? Or you've had maybe people watching a few too many James Bond movies, and they think that a bullet through the size of the fuselage will kind of create some gaping hole, and everybody will get sucked out of it. I don't know, are there pilots in here? There's usually a few pilots in the audience this big. Well, a couple pilots here. Well, then there are already lots of little holes in planes, okay? And in fact, if you're in any commercial airline, what you're going to know is there's a hole at the back that kind of helps pull the air through the fuselage there. One more hole, you're not going to notice, okay? And there's a reason why the Air Force doesn't worry about one bullet taking down its planes when they fly over there. And anyway, but the interesting thing here is you just don't have to rely on these types of guesses. You may not realize this, but from 1923 until 1963, all commercial airline pilots in the United States who were flying, and I can tell many of us are old enough to have flown on planes during that period of time, were mandated to carry loaded handguns with them when they flew. Basically, it was a rule that had gotten into place when the United States Postal Service started sending mail by biplane back then. And they didn't want a biplane crashing in some cornfield someplace and somebody stealing the mail. So they put in a rule that just said, since there's a chance that you might be carrying mail on your commercial flight, we're mandating that you have to carry a loaded handgun with you at all times. So you had all these flights for 4 decades, basically all the commercial airline pilots were mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them. But even after 1963, from then until 1979, when it was ended by Jimmy Carter, commercial airline pilots were still allowed to carry loaded handguns with them. And according to the airline pilots unions, you were able to have maybe up to 15% or so of the commercial airline pilots carrying loaded handguns with them. And so we don't have to guess about all these hypotheticals. We can go back and look. And you can go back and look at the old Civil Aeronautics Board documents and for the FAA. And there's not one single recorded incident, despite millions of flights, where something went wrong with one of these pilots going and carrying a gun. And so rather than going and saying, well, what if, just looking at the data there shows that it's not really much to worry about. In fact, when you actually go through the old CAB records, there's actually several dozen cases where commercial airline pilots actually use their guns to stop crimes on planes and a few other places. I don't know if any of you have read Colin Powell's autobiography or Antonin Scalia's autobiography, but both of these two men grew up in New York City. Both of them were on their riflery teams for their public high schools. And it's amazing how little New Yorkers even seem to know about their past history. But up until 1969, all but one of the public high schools in New York City had a riflery team. And at any given, and the guns weren't kept there at school. People would bring them to school with them in the morning, store them unlocked in the back of homerooms, take them to go to the firing range in the afternoon, and then take them home in the evening. So on any given school day, you apparently had someplace between 6,000 and 8,000 kids between the ages of 13 and 18, basically walking around on city streets or on subways or on buses or on taxis, just carrying around rifles. And you go and you tell that now to somebody in New York City, they're going to think you're from Mars, even having talked about something. They're claiming it's true. For a group like this, I'll just also mention, if you want to get puzzled looks from people in New York City, just mention how all the subways were built privately and run privately. Basically what happened there, the government put price controls around World War I that didn't allow them to raise their fares above 5 cents, and that eventually bankrupted the subway companies and then took them over and then raised prices. But anyway, so you can go and look at the records there, and again, you don't find things that went wrong. Now, I just want to take a minute and talk about some of the general types of data that exist there, given that this is a university, and because there's a lot of data that's used here, but I think people don't always understand the weaknesses and strength of the data. So there's three types of data that you have. You have what we call purely cross-sectional data, which is you're looking at one point in time, you're looking across different places at that point in time. You have time series data, which you're looking at one jurisdiction over time, looking kind of before and after some change in the law. And you have panel data, which kind of combines those two. So anybody maybe who's taken an econometrics class or what have you probably has some rough idea of what I'm talking about. Pretty much any economist now, if they, unless they only have time series or cross-sectional data or use panel data, criminology is pretty much the same thing. And I'm just going to try to explain to you why they do that. Let me give you an example with regard to time series first, and that is the problem with time series data is you really only have one experiment. And it's very hard often to kind of disentangle different changes that can happen. The problem with cross-sectional data, I'll give you an example with regard to a report from the New York Times some years ago about the death penalty. They looked at murder rates in states with the death penalty and murder rates in states without the death penalty, and they said, look, the murder rate's higher in states with the death penalty. So being the New York Times, they said that must prove that if anything, it did lower, but maybe even the death penalty caused murder rates to go up. Well, here's the problem, and that is, I don't know if you know what states generally have had the death penalty and those that haven't, but the states that haven't had the death penalty have been like Alaska, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Vermont. Generally, most of them are very low murder rate and crime rate states. They've always been that way. So let's say the high crime rate states felt the need to adopt the death penalty, and they did, and let's say it caused the murder rate to fall, but by not enough so it didn't get as low as the low murder rate states that didn't adopt the rules. So I'm just saying this hypothetical. If I only look across states, what's it going to look like? It's going to look like death penalty, higher murder rate, even though it caused it to fall from what it was before. The only way you can really disentangle that and find whether it increased it or fell is by looking over time to see how the murder rate changed before and after they changed the law, and to see how it's changing relative to the states that didn't change their law over that period of time. And that's basically what panel data is. And there's so many things that differ across places that it's very hard with purely cross-sectional data to account for those differences. So I'm sure you've heard in the debates, for example, they'll say, look, the United Kingdom has a low murder rate compared to the United States, about 28-30% of the murder rate in the United States, and it has a low gun ownership rate, so therefore it must be the fact that they have low gun ownership that means that they have relatively few murders. Well, one point just to mention is that they had even lower murder rates before they had the gun control rules that were there. And that's true. There have basically been three major gun control rules that have been there: 1920, 1956, 1997. And after each of those, we had an increase in murder rates and violent crime rates. I'll show you a graph in a minute for that. But let me just, okay, so I think if you're going to go and ask your teachers who do empirical work in economics or some of these other areas if they put much stock in purely cross-sectional data, my guess is they would say no. But I'm just going to show you some information about cross-sectional data, just some examples. So again, I'm not going to put a lot of weight on it, but I just want to show you. One of the things is, if you look at gun ownership and homicide rates for all the countries in the world. Now, I have to tell you, this measure of gun ownership, firearms per 100,000, is from something called the Small Arms Survey. If you read the New York Times, God only knows they must have referenced this survey about 50 times. And I'm just going to use this for the sake of argument because this is what a lot of people use. There's a real problem with this measure. Basically, this is the United States out here, according to them. And someplace like Switzerland is about here, and Israel is someplace around here. And I don't know anybody who's really looked at this carefully believes that there's a reason why they can get Israel down at about 10%, and that's because technically in Israel, most people don't own guns. The government, quote, owns the gun, but it gives it to you. And you can have it essentially for life. So how do I count it? Do I count it as just the guns you personally own, or the guns that you may have possession of for decades? And it seems to me the most reasonable way is saying, do I have control of the firearm? Even if I technically don't own it. And if you did that, Israel has a gun possession rate that's higher than the United States. But they also have a very, very low murder rate. They have one of the lowest murder rates in the world, which would mess up kind of the discussions a lot of people have. Switzerland has a similar type of issue. You had in 2007, which is when the Small Arms Survey data came out, a lot of people, all able-bodied males between the ages of 18 and 42, were required to have a machine gun at their home. And you were allowed to get exemptions, which were pretty easy to get once you were past 42, and people would have them in their 60s and 70s. And if you count those, you're going to get a gun possession rate in Switzerland, which would be about 20 percentage points higher than the gun possession rate in the United States. Switzerland has traditionally had one of the lowest murder rates in Europe. You can see why that would mess it up too. So there are a lot of problems. I don't believe this measure of gun ownership much at all. I'm just using it because that's what everybody does in terms of this discussion, okay? But if you look at all the countries that are here, even using their measure of gun ownership, you basically get this negative type of relationship here. More firearms, according to the Small Arms Survey, means a lower homicide rate. Now, if you kind of look at it just in terms of homicides, this gives you just some rough idea. I couldn't really get, it's like you're missing the in-between country here if you're trying to read the bottom here. But you can get some idea. In terms of homicide rates, the United States about here. You can see how high it goes for some countries. Incidentally, all the top 10 countries in terms of murder rates have gun bans. But anyway, and just something else to point out here. When we talk about murder rates for countries, it can often be very misleading. So in the United States, our murder rate right now is about 4.5 per 100,000. It's a little bit higher back in 2007, which this comparison involved. When people think about it, but I think it's misleading to think of a murder rate for the U.S. because it varies hugely across the United States. You have 78% of the counties in the United States in any given year that have 0 murders. You have 3% of the counties, which account for about 23% of the population, which have over 70% of the murders taking place. And if you ever live in a major city like Chicago or Washington, D.C. or New York or Los Angeles or Detroit or other places, often the newspapers in those cities once a year will print a map that shows you the distribution of murders there. And what you'll find is that even in these cities, these areas where all these murders in the United States are concentrated, they're not evenly spread out over those cities. They're usually in a few very small pockets where virtually all the murders take place. And a lot of that is kind of drug gang type stuff. I don't completely agree with the Obama administration on this, but they put out a report in 2009 that claimed that about 80% of violent crimes in the United States were gang-related. The vast majority of those were drug gang-related. And it would be roughly right. There's some assumptions that I don't agree with completely. And we'll get more into the drug issue later on. But the point is that you have these small pockets where the vast majority of murders in the United States are taking place. And it's not, most of the country has no murders. And the part of the country that has no murders, that's where the gun ownership actually tends to be highest by far in the United States. So, now I can just show you, if you just look at developed countries, these are the OECD countries, and you just ask yourself, if I take the other developed countries other than the United States is way out here, has a murder rate that's, you can see about 4.5 right now, which is about where Turkey is, a little bit higher, lower than some of the other countries there. But if you look at the other countries and you just say, what could the United States learn from looking at these other countries, even using the small arms survey data, homicide rate and these number of guns per 100 people, you can see even in this case you get a negative relationship that exists there. And you can see across all these developed countries what the homicide rate is. Okay, so again, I'm just showing you this. I don't want to put a lot of weight on cross-sectional data, really none at all, but since it's talked about a lot, I just wanted to kind of show you that even if you look at it in terms of overall murders, that you get a relationship that's kind of different than a lot of people think. Okay, now I'm going to start to get into what I think is a little bit more useful data. And I want to try to talk about places, just a simple experiment where guns have been banned in different places, to see what's happened to murder rates before and after the ban. And two places where it seems useful to start are Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And I could give you 30 pages of quotes after the Supreme Court decision in Heller in 2008, but I'm just going to give you one here. And the first one is the mayor of Washington, D.C. at the time said, more handguns than in Columbia will only lead to more gun violence. And as I say, I could give you politicians and gun control groups and everybody else that are predicting disaster. Now, before I go on, I want to point out what's a really crucial difference between the Supreme Court decision in 2008 for Washington, D.C. and for 2010, the McDonald decision by the Supreme Court for Chicago. And the difference, the similarity, is that both struck down handgun bans that were there. The handgun ban being struck down really hasn't made a huge difference. The reason why it hasn't made a huge difference in crime rates afterwards is you've only had a few thousand people who have been able to go and get licenses for handguns in either of those cities. In Washington, D.C., according to the Washington Post, it costs about $534 to go through the licensing and registration and training fees that you have to have there in the city. In Chicago, it's hundreds of dollars to go through that same process. And so you have a couple things. Not only do you have a few people who have been able to go and get handguns, but basically who has gotten a handgun in Washington, D.C. legally is basically well-to-do whites. And my research has been convincing me, if anything, the people who benefit the most from owning guns are the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. And that tends to be overwhelmingly poor blacks. And, you know, it'd be great if the police were there all the time. My research indicates the police, to me, are the single most important factor. But when the police can't be there, having a gun is the best course of action. So you don't really expect a big effect in crime rate, or even a noticeable. When you're talking about Chicago, and there it's only been a couple thousand people. In a city of 2.5 million people. And it's not the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime who are the ones who've got the permits to have a handgun. You don't really expect much of an effect there. The big difference is with regard to D.C. though, because D.C. had another law at that time, and their law had actually made it a felony for you to put a bullet in the chamber of a long gun or a shotgun shell in the chamber of a shotgun. People were allowed to own licensed and registered long guns, but it was a felony for them to actually use it in self-defense, because presumably to use it you put a bullet in the chamber. And so the Supreme Court basically said, look, we think that there's an individual right to self-defense, but if we don't strike down this law that makes it a felony for you to put a bullet in the chamber within Washington, D.C., it won't do people a lot of good. And so they struck down this regulation, this Lott type law, dealing with being able to actually fire the gun or to use it. Now, the thing with D.C. is, at the time in 2008, there were about 72,000 individuals who legally own rifles and shotguns. And so that's almost a quarter of the adult population in Washington, D.C. So overnight, you had a quarter of the law-abiding, quarter of the adult population who now could legally use guns for self-defense, whereas they couldn't before. And so that's a pretty big change. It's not like 2,000 people or 3,000 people being able to have handguns. And we'll see kind of what that has applied for D.C. Now, I'm going to show you some data for Washington, D.C. and Chicago. There's lots of ways we could illustrate changing crime rates. The simplest way is just to say what's happened to murder rates in the cities over time. And if you look at Washington, D.C., their handgun ban went into effect, the gun laws went into effect in 1977, February 77. There's only 1 year after the ban where D.C.'s murder rate was as low as it was when the ban went into effect. It was 1984. Every other year for the next 30 years it was higher, often much higher. In Chicago, there's no year after its ban went into effect where its murder rate was as low. Now, the most reasonable comparison, at least for simple things, I can go and run regressions, and I've done that in More Guns, Less Crime and other places. But I just want to try to show you the raw data here. So one simple comparison is just to see how these two cities' murder rates have changed relative to other cities, you know, before and after the ban has been put in place. And one way of just kind of looking at that is just to see how does D.C. rank or Chicago rank relative to other cities. So if you look at the top 50 cities, prior to the ban, D.C. ranked about 20th in terms of the top 50 cities in murder rates. After the ban went into effect, half the time it was either number 1 or number 2 in terms of murder rates, and 2/3 of the time it was in the top 4. There's no period of time prior to the ban going into effect where D.C. was anywhere even close to the top 4. The highest it ever got prior to the ban was 15 in terms of the top 50 cities. Another way of looking at this is to look at kind of the ratio of D.C.'s murder rate, D.C.'s murder rate relative to the average, the weighted average for the murder rates for the other 50 largest cities, or the simple average if you look at either one. What you find basically is D.C.'s murder rate was falling from about 40% above the average for the other cities to about 10%, 12% above prior to the ban. After the ban went into effect, at the beginning of 77, it rose about 40%, 60%. You get about 13 years out, it's about 80% higher. Now, so that basically takes you there. The reason why I showed you this, as you can see the increase here, But there's such a huge increase that occurred in this period of time, it's kind of important to break them out separately. There's about a 4-year period of time here where the crack cocaine epidemic hit. It hit not only D.C., it's basically a national phenomenon. But it hit D.C. much worse than it did other cities. I would argue in part because people in D.C. were less able to go and defend themselves against the chaos they kind of came about from the crack cocaine epidemic. But even after it ended, D.C.'s murder rate relative to the murder rate in the other 50 largest cities remained very high. Now, what's happened after the gun ban was struck down and the gun laws were changed? Well, that occurred in June 2008, and by the end of July 2008, D.C. had rewritten its gun control laws in order to deal with that. So there's different ways I could look at this. I could also make a comparison relative to other cities. I just thought I'd just show you very simple data here that I think is pretty graphic. Now, what we're going to do is, I could look at the whole year. If I looked at whole years, you'd still get about a 50% drop. And this is like more than 5 times the average drop for other cities. But if we just look at the kind of raw data here, I'm going to look at the first 7 months of each year, because it's the first 7 months of 08 are the last 7 months of the bans in place there. And the reason why you want to look at the same period each time is that murder rates vary a lot over the course of the year. You have a lot more murders and violent crimes during the summer than you do during the winter. So the first 7 months of 07, 08, 09, 2010, 2011, 2012. The first 7 months of 07, it was 104 murders. 08, 107. 09, it was down to 82. 2010, it was down to 70. 2011, it was 62. In 2012, it was down to 51. That's a 52% drop in 4 years. My guess is that if D.C.'s murder rate had gone up by 52% in 4 years after the Supreme Court decision, you would probably be hearing more about it. But the violent crime rates fell across the board. There were lots of interesting patterns I could point to here. I'm just going to point to one. And that is, and this is something that we see generally, and that is when you allow law-abiding citizens to have guns, you see not only a drop in violent crime, but you see a much bigger drop in violent crime involving guns than violent crimes without guns. What basically seems to happen is when you allow law-abiding citizens to have guns, the criminals are less likely to carry guns themselves. And if you look at it, so here's robbery. Robbery, excluding guns, was basically flat, fell by a 1%, not even noticeable. Robberies with guns fell by 11%. Aggravated assaults without guns, excluding guns, fell by 4%. Aggravated assaults with using guns fell by 31%. You can see a much bigger drop in violent crimes with guns than without guns. Now, as I say, we can go and do more sophisticated stuff. We can go and have regressions. I'm not going to really go through that because I think it may be opaque to a lot of people. But you can control for police, arrest, conviction rates, prison sentence lengths, the death penalty, number of police, expenditures on police, different types of policing policies when you're looking at city data, population density, 13 different types of gun control laws, demographics, income, poverty, lots of other things. And even if you account for all these things along with for statistical geeks out there, fixed effects, you basically find even larger things than I'm showing you with the raw data here. Now, how about Chicago? So if we look at Chicago in the same way, you're looking at the years prior to the ban, which went into effect in late November 1982. Chicago's murder rate, relative to the murder rate from the 9 largest cities, and more guns, less crime, I do it for the 50 largest cities also. But you get very, very similar graphs. It went from about 65% above the average for those other cities to about 5% below during that period of time. After the ban has gone into effect, you generally see an increase. So it stopped falling and then generally started to rise after the ban. There's no year after the ban went in place where Chicago's average relative to the other cities was as low as what they got right before the ban went into effect. Now I can show you lots of other comparisons. This is just a comparison for the counties that border Chicago before and after the ban. And again, you can see that prior to the ban, Chicago's murder rate relative to the adjacent counties was falling. After the ban, it was increasing fairly substantially. Not all the counties in Illinois, there's one county in Indiana, but not all the counties in Illinois reported murder rates for 1984, so that's the reason for the gap there. But a very dramatic change. Now, I mentioned we can look at other countries around the world. And I'm just going to show you data. My folks have looked at other countries, but I'm just going to show you data for just a few island nations that have banned guns, either all guns or handguns. And you can look at Ireland. Their gun ban went into effect, this is the Republic of Ireland, went into effect in January 1972. Prior to the ban, its murder rate was bouncing up and down. After the ban, it shot up. Always much higher. Now here, there's a lot of drug gang problems. We can talk about that more later. Obviously, at the very least, the ban didn't stop the drug gangs from getting a hold of guns. You can look at Jamaica here. Its gun ban went into effect in 1975. Prior to 75, Jamaica's murder rate was very similar to the murder rate in the United States. Now there's some political violence here, there's some drug gang and political violence here, but again, even if you extract away from those, the murder rate in Jamaica is much higher after the ban went into effect than it was previously. Now I just mentioned one thing here, and that is, in the United States, we've obviously spent a lot of time and effort to try to keep illegal drugs out of the country, with kind of relatively limited success. But here's the problem, and that is, just as drug gangs go and bring in illegal drugs to go and sell in the country, they also bring in weapons to be able to go and defend those drugs. It's not like I can go and have one gang go and steal another gang's drugs and have the gang that lost the drugs go and call the police and say, look, you help us get it back. These guys stole our drugs. So they have a very valuable commodity there. And so they essentially go and set up their own little military in order to protect their valuable property. My guess is that tomorrow we can wave a magic wand to kind of temper or remove all the existing drugs, illegal drugs and guns in the United States. I don't know, maybe a couple days, a week. We probably have the illegal drugs back in the country. But probably just as quickly they would have weapons in order to go and defend that very valuable property. They're not going to bring in the valuable property unless they have some way of going and defending it. So now here's Britain's handgun ban went into effect in January 1997. And you can see here, for basically the next 8 years, there's a very large increase in murder rates. It basically went up by about 50%. After that point, it fell. So should we conclude that there's like an 8-year lag, you put a ban in effect, things don't go right for 8 years, and then it works out? Well, I don't think so. Here is something else that also just changed right at that period of time, and that is the number of police in the UK. In 2002, you can see what it is. In 2003, 2004, you can see huge increases right at that period of time in terms of the number of police. They basically have an 18% increase in the number of police. And right when they increase the number of police, they have this drop in murder rate. And it's still, if you look at the numbers here, it's still higher at the end than it was before, immediately before the ban went into effect. And now it's come down a little bit, but it's still much higher than it was before. Now, people were basically very upset with the surge in crime, and so the government tried to do what it could to have more police to deal with it. And my research indicates that police are probably the single most important factor for reducing crime. And if you have an 18% increase in the number of police, that's going to be noticeable. I can show you stuff, brother, because now Australia doesn't have a complete gun ban. Didn't ban any type of guns completely. What it did was, in 96 and 97, it had a gun buyback. And in that period of time, they basically reduced the number of guns in circulation legally from about 3.2 million to about 2.2 million. What's usually not talked about is that after they had the gun buyback, people started buying guns again. And basically the gun ownership rate now is pretty close to what it was, almost the same as what it was when the gun buyback occurred. Well, if they're right about the arguments that are being made often in the media, then we should have seen a certain pattern, right? If it's just the number of guns, then what should we have seen? We should have seen a drop in whatever bad things they attributed to that. And then we should have seen an increase as the gun ownership rate was increasing very quickly relative to the population after that. Because this is a huge drop from 3.2 to 2.2 million. That's a third drop in the number of guns there. Well, here's homicides in Australia. Basically, for the next 8 years, it's very flat, and then it begins to drop off a little bit after that. But you don't see this pattern where it plummets and then it goes up. Now, how about for armed robberies? Well, this doesn't work out very well for them. Armed robberies basically soared after the gun buyback, stayed pretty high, and now it's about down to where it was, or slightly higher, whatever, about where it was right before the gun buyback went into effect. Now, here's something that's often pointed to, and that is the drop in firearm suicides. This is the dotted line, the firearm suicide rate in Australia. And this is the non-firearm suicide rate. And this is where they had the gun buyback. Well, there's a couple little things that they fail to note when you read the editorials in the New York Times. And that is, the firearm suicide rate in Australia was already falling for over a decade before the buyback occurred. It looks to me like the rate of decline is pretty much the same over the whole period, so it's hard to see any impact from that. The only thing that seemed to fall after that is the non-firearm suicide rate. And the drop there basically is virtually the exact same size as the drop in firearm suicide. So either by looking at the change in firearm suicides over the whole period rather than just afterwards, or looking at how the firearm suicide rate changes compared to the non-firearm suicide rate changes, the non-firearm suicide rate. It's pretty hard. And surely, what you would, if the claim was right, there should have been a drop and then it should have increased again. And we don't see that either. So it's kind of hard to see how that fits in with the explanation. Now, why is it when we see these bans on handguns or bans on all guns that we see these increases in murder, in violent crime? And I think there's a relatively simple explanation to what's going on. And the explanation is that when you ban guns, and this is true, you have to think about for gun laws generally, you have to ask yourself who obeys the law. Good people. Good answer. And so, and the problem is, I'm not saying that this doesn't affect criminals, I think it does. But the problem is who does it affect relatively more? If you relatively disarm good law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you can actually make it easier for them on average to go and commit these crimes. And, in the introductions here, people were talking about universities and schools being gun-free zones. And here's the deal. Let me just give you an example to think about this. And that is concealed carry state. You can carry guns pretty much virtually any place in the state. But if you're a professor, even though you can carry virtually any place in the state, if you accidentally carry your permanent concealed handgun onto campus property here and you get caught, what's going to happen? You're going to get fired for a firearms-related violation. If you get fired for a firearms-related violation, what do you think is going to be your odds of getting another academic job at another university in the U.S.? Essentially zero. To get fired from a university for firearms-related violation at the university, you're not going to get hired someplace else. If you're a student over 21 and you have a concealed handgun permit, again, you can take it virtually any place in the state. But if you accidentally take it onto university property and you get caught, you're going to get expelled. Your chances of admitted to another university is going to be pretty close to zero. You're going to have, in both of these cases, it's going to be life-altering effect of being caught, right? The professor is going to have to find something completely different to do rather than academia. The student is going to have to reconcile themselves. If you're in law school or you're in business school or you're about ready to finish up your BA or BS, you have to realize you're not going to get those degrees. You know, if you maybe the rest of your life without an undergraduate degree or not get a law degree or whatever, your life is going to be dramatically changed. Well, how about a killer in these cases? So you take something like the Virginia Tech attack, where the guy killed 32 people. Even assuming he lived, and he didn't, and 75% of the time when people do these multiple victim public shootings, they don't survive the attack. And even the 25% where they do survive, it's just because they planned on committing suicide, but at the last moment they just couldn't bring themselves to pull the trigger to kill themselves. So, but let's assume that the guy lived. How much of a penalty does the threat of expulsion represent? I mean, I don't know if I assume he would have understood this, but if he faces 32 death penalties or 32 life sentences, the question of whether he's still going to be attending classes or not is probably not going to be something that's really going to be open for discussion. So I don't know if you've taken like a law and economics class, but if you have, one of the ideas that they'll get across in the class is what they call marginal deterrence, all right? What may look like the same penalty actually can represent quite different costs that you're going to be imposing on two different people. So in this case, it looks like you have the same penalty expulsion, but in practice, the actual penalty that you're imposing on a law-abiding citizen is much, much, much bigger than it is on this criminal in this case. And so, you know, basically you have a situation where the good people have an incentive. They probably would obey the law more likely anyway, but they have a greater incentive also to obey the law than the criminal does, despite what might have been the intent of the law. And the problem when you disarm the law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, I would argue, you actually make it more likely that the crime would occur. Let me actually, just to kind of make this clear. Let's say, God forbid, some violent criminal was stalking you or your family. Would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said, "This home is a gun-free zone"? How many people would put up a sign? No. I have to say, you know, two people. You'd actually put up a sign. Why would you put up a sign like that? You're just joking. Okay, why would you put up a sign in front of your home that said your home is a gun-free zone? I'm not saying, I'm not even getting to that right now. I'm just saying why, I'm not saying whether you think it's good that you have a gun in the home or not. I'm just saying, why did you put up a sign like that? What impact, you really have somebody who's threatening you, stalking you, and you say, I'm just going to put up a sign in front of my home that said, just to tell him, in case he didn't know, I'm going to tell the potential attacker that I don't have a gun there. Okay, so you're indifferent. You're not really sure because if it took any time, you probably wouldn't bother putting it aside. No, but you're telling them you don't own a gun. That's what the sign says. Okay. Well, you're about to, I think you're the first person you'd actually put up a sign like that in front of your home. You feel safer doing that? Okay, well that's what I'm asking about, was you advertise what you own the gun. Would you advertise it? Well, that's interesting. Okay, I just wanted to find out. Other people, I think, my own guess is you're conflating a couple different issues in your answer.
Are we conflating a couple issues, or are you conflating a couple issues?
Do what now? I'm sorry.
Are we conflating a couple issues, or are you conflating a couple?
Well, in your answers, you were going about whether or not you should own a gun, and that wasn't my question. You can get into that later. My question was whether you would advertise it. But in your answers, particularly at the beginning, you kept on bringing up about whether you should own a gun in the home. And we could talk about that too, but that wasn't the question I was asking. So, anyway, we'll get into more about whether people should own a gun in a minute. But I was just asking whether you would advertise it. Now, work that Bill Landis and I did when we were at the University of Chicago looked at all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States from 1977 through 1999. And we looked at 13 different types of gun control laws. We looked at police, other things, and we found a few interesting things. Police, as I mentioned earlier, I think are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But one of the things is that they didn't seem to have a statistically significant impact on these multiple victim public shootings. And I think there's a simple reason for that. And that is, how does law enforcement work? Law enforcement works by catching and punishing people after the fact. Okay? What we were talking about before is basically all these guys planned on dying at the crime scene. 75% died, the other 25% planned on dying, but they just couldn't bring themselves to commit suicide. If you're not expecting to be alive after the crime, law enforcement isn't going to be particularly relevant for how effective it is and what the penalties are in that case. We looked at 13 different types of gun control laws, and the only one that seemed to matter was the passage of concealed carry laws. When states passed a concealed carry law, there was about a 60% drop in the rate of multiple victim public shootings, and there was about a 78% drop in the rate at which people were killed or injured from these attacks. And to the extent to which they still occurred in these states, they occurred in the tiny areas within the states where permanent concealed guns weren't allowed, the so-called gun-free zone. And one of the things that's interesting, in the United States, if you look at all the multiple victim public shootings since at least 1950, with just two exceptions, every single one has occurred in places where guns are banned. I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, the Aurora, Colorado shooting last summer at the Batman movie theater. There were 7 movie theaters showing the premiere of the Batman movie on July 20th within a 20-minute drive of the killer's apartment. Only one of those had signs banning permanent concealed handguns. Colorado allows it up to private property owners to post whether or not permanent concealed handguns can be allowed on their private property. The killer didn't go to the movie theater that was closest to his home. There was one that was only 1.2 miles away. He didn't go to the movie theater, which advertised quite prominently that they had the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado. You would think that would be attractive on a premiere night to go to the auditoriums that would have the most potential victims in it. There was one, that movie theater was 4.8 miles away. Instead, he went to a movie theater that was 4.6 miles away, which was the only movie theater that posted signs banning permanent concealed handguns that didn't allow victims to be able to go and defend themselves. Look at the 3 big mall shootings that we've had. Omaha, Nebraska. I'll get to questions. Omaha, Nebraska, Kansas City, Salt Lake City. In Omaha, Nebraska, you had 7 enclosed malls. Only one of those had signs banning permanent concealed handguns. In Salt Lake City, you had 8 enclosed malls. 2 of them had signs banning permanent concealed handguns. In Kansas City, you had 1 mall that banned permanent concealed handguns. Where do you think the attacks occurred in each of those places? They occurred in the places where there were signs banning permanent concealed handguns. All the multiple victim public shootings in Europe has a rate of multiple victim public shootings that's actually similar to the rate in the United States. People don't think about it because all these small separate countries, they don't think of adding them up and putting it on a per capita rate. But Even Switzerland, all the multiple victim public shootings in Switzerland, where the concealed carry is very easy to get. Half the country, half the canton, you don't even need a permit to carry. It's only been since 2000 that they've had any gun-free zones in Switzerland. They've had 3 multiple victim public shootings since 2000, none beforehand. All the ones have occurred in the tiny areas in the country where permanent concealed handguns are allowed. The largest was in the parliamentary building in the canton of Zug in 2001, in which 14 members of parliament were killed by somebody who went inside there. Another government building that 10 people killed. So, now, there's some interesting things here. One is you see a much bigger drop in multiple victim public shootings after right to carry law goes into effect than you see drop in murder rates. Murder rates fall by about 1.5% each year for about 8 years that a right to carry law is in effect. But as I said, you see the 60% drop in these multiple victim public shootings after a right to carry law is in effect. Why the difference? And again, I think there's a very simple explanation. Let's say you have 5% or 7% of the adult population with concealed handgun permits in the state. If a criminal goes and attacks somebody late at night in a dark parking lot or an alley, there's some chance that the victim can defend themselves, some risk to the criminal. And you see some deterrence. I don't know, we have maybe 150 people here, maybe more. Let's say there's a 5% chance that any one individual here has a permanent concealed handgun. And let's assume that the problems are independent. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case for Students for Liberty thing. But let's just assume that they'd be independent probabilities. Then, the chance that at least someone who would be unknown to the attacker here would be able to have a gun to defend themselves would be essentially 100%. And what you see in this research is that as the probability that someone's able to go and defend themselves increases, you see greater deterrence that's going to do it. Now I want to talk a little bit about Israel. Israel's had a very long history, as everybody knows, of terrorist attacks. If you go and look at, even before the country was founded, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, there's one interesting characteristic about the terrorist attacks, and that is virtually all of them involve machine guns. After 1972, almost all the terrorist attacks in Israel involved bombs. Does anybody know what changed? There's no technological change in building bombs in 72. There are some technological changes that one can talk about in the mid-80s. But what changed in 72? Anybody have an idea? Yeah.
I believe they had much more lax.
Well, they started letting civilians carry concealed handguns at the time. In fact, you had as high as 15% of the adult Jewish population being able to carry concealed handguns. So why did they make that change? Well, what happened is that for years after terrorist attacks occurred, Israel would try to put more military, more police on the streets. But the problem they learned is that terrorists have a huge strategic advantage. Let's say there's a terrorist on the bus, and you have a couple police officers that are there. What are the options that the terrorists have? One option that they have is simply to be patient, to wait until the officers leave, and then go and do their attack. Another option that they have is to try to kill the officers first, because they're the only ones that they had to worry about, and then go and try to kill other people that were there. What Israel learned is that they just didn't have infinite money. That no matter how many police officers they hired or military they put on the street, if a terrorist was simply willing to be patient long enough, there would be some opening that they could go and engage in their attack. So what they started doing is allowing citizens to carry concealed handguns. Now, how did that change the strategic calculus on the part of the terrorists that were there? Well, when you had uniformed officers or police there, the terrorists knew who they had to be worried about. But when you had concealed carry permit holders, they didn't know whether there was a guy behind them, on the side, the other side, or in the front. that they had to go and worry about. They didn't know who they had to go and take out first. So what did they switch to? They switched to bombs, because if you pulled out your machine gun and started to fire, you gave people around you a chance to go and respond. There's one news article from Israel that I quote from in More Guns, Less Crime, where shortly after they had changed the policy there, 4 terrorists attacked a suburban mall outside of Tel Aviv on a school afternoon. And they pulled out their machine guns, started firing, and the people in the mall pulled out their handguns, started firing back. And 3 of the terrorists were killed. The 4th one survived, though he was seriously wounded. But when he was being taken to the hospital, the newspaper afterwards interviewed one of the attendants in the ambulance, and they reported how the terrorist was just so upset that nobody had told him that all these elderly ladies in the mall would be pulling out their handguns and firing back. I don't know, he called it a front, that it was older women who were taking them out. But anyway, but if you set off a bomb, there's really no way for you to respond. Now, as an economist, I don't know how many econ majors there are here, but there's something that we often refer to as revealed preference, and that is terrorists had a choice between using bombs or machine guns before the policy changed there. They decided to use machine guns. They seemed to think that that was more effective, and Bill and I, in fact, found evidence that the casualty rate per attack fell when they switched from machine guns to bombs. Plus, obviously, the terrorists were more likely to die themselves. And so, anyway, there's a lot of interesting things you can learn from there. Now, there's other things I can talk about here. I talked about Europe, for example. One thing that's interesting is the behavior of permit holders. You know, when people talk about allowing permanent concealed handguns on the college campuses, I mean, the governor here just vetoed a bill that had been passed by the state legislature. One of the concerns that's brought up is, what about college students going and doing crazy things? They're drunk. Who knows, they may do things with guns afterwards. Well, you can look at the behavior of permit holders generally, and we can look at the behavior of permit holders of that age, and you can also look at states that currently allow people to carry concealed handguns on school property. And lots of states used to allow this prior to the early 90s. And again, in all those types of breakdowns, you find that permit holders tend to be extremely law-abiding. If you look at Florida, for example, which has very good data that you can get on the website, just Google Florida concealed carry statistics. Texas also has good numbers that you can see on the website. Other states do. Florida, between October 1987, when they started issuing permits, and June 30th of last year, had issued permits to over 2.3 million people. The average permit holder had their permit for over 13 years. With all those millions of people having all those permits for all those years, there were 168 permits that had been revoked for any type of firearms-related violation. The vast majority, almost all those, were for one reason: people accidentally carrying permanent concealed handguns into gun-free zones. The second most likely reason was people forgetting to have their concealed handgun permit with them. And so, and you can look at the states that have allowed this, and you just don't find any examples where a concealed carry permit holder was allowed to carry a gun on a school property, either K through 12 or university, where they've done something wrong. What we get into here, I just thought I'd show you quickly here. There's a survey of police officers, about 15,000, by a group called Police One, which is kind of the largest police magazine in the country. And this was just of officers, managerial officers, or street officers, or retired officers. 80% of the people they surveyed were active duty. One of the questions they ask is, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low and 5 being high, how important do you think legally armed citizens are to reducing overall crime rates? 55% gave it a ranking of 5. 22% gave it a ranking of 4. So you have 75% of these police officers in the United States view it as very important in terms of reducing overall crime that citizens be allowed to own guns. You look at 1 or 2, adding those two together doesn't even get you to 10% of the officers. You look at things like assault weapons bans, 71% said the assault weapon ban would have no effect on violent crime. 22% said it would have a negative effect on violent crime. You can look at magazine size limit. 96% of police officers in the United States said that it would have no effect. If you looked at basically what we're talking about these days, which is these background checks, almost 80% said no effect. And here's more, another question on background checks. And here you can see for this gun registry, which is part of the bills that are being talked about federally right now, 72% of police officers say it would have no beneficial impact on crime rates to have a gun registry. And there's other things we can go down here too. Gun buyback programs, 82% say that gun buyback programs would have no effect. And we can talk about this more. What I'm happy to do, so when we're doing the questions. Here, let me just conclude here, and then we'll get the questions. Somebody's interpretation. Look, my research finds that the police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But there's basically two groups of people who benefit the most from owning guns. It's people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. Women benefit much more than men do. We basically talk about a male, usually a young male criminal doing the attacking. In the case of a male criminal attacking a female victim, there's a larger strength differential that exists there than a male attacking a male. The presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and resist an attack. And the other group of people who benefit the most are poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. The people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime when the police can't be there to go and protect them are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. So I know people have some questions. There's one woman who's been raising her hand multiple times here. So, but anyway, thank you. I have copies of several of my books that people are interested in buying them afterwards. Since you've been so eager, we'll let you go first. I don't know if you're with the other two back there, but in any case, ask the question.
If you are, can I have your ticket if you're not going to take a gun?
Let her ask the question. Go ahead. That's fine.
What system and structure exists that redefines the crimes, and how does gun ownership control? What systems and structures exist that redefine the crimes, and how does gun ownership control relate to these systems of crime and violence?
Right. Well, I guess I tried to go over that a little bit in the talk. I mean, I think one of the things that I think, okay, she's asking kind of what causes higher violent crime rates in the United States. At least that's roughly how I took your question. Right, okay, I understand. And how can gun control be related to reducing that? Now, there are lots of things that vary across countries. Some of them I say we don't understand. Like you look at many countries like England. It's amazing, before their first gun control law in 1920, you look at London. There are years where you have like 2 murders in a city of 8 million people with no gun regulations and extremely wide gun ownership that was there. The United States at the same period of time had much higher murder rates. So there are lots of things that vary. One of the key things for the United States right now, I think, and maybe during the 20s and the 30s, where we also had very high murder rates, has been prohibition or having illegal drugs. And I try to talk about that some. I mean, you go and look across the United States. I may not agree exactly with the Obama administration when they talk about 80% of violent crime being gang-related. I'm willing to say that the Obama administration is roughly in the ballpark on that. But, if you just look at the maps that we were talking about, in the United States, with a huge percentage of violent crimes in the United States are concentrated in just very tiny areas within this country. They're not uniformly spread out. They're not even uniformly spread out in major urban cities that are there. And it's hard to look at that type of thing and not realize how closely related that is to illegal drug activity that's going on. People often hear a lot about acquaintance murder and things like that. What most people don't realize is that the vast majority of acquaintance murders in the United States are rival gang members killing each other. It's very common when you have two gangs near each other that they know who the members of the other gang are that are there. And so, I think one of the problems that we have, and I'm not saying it's nirvana to go and liberalize drug rules. You liberalize drug rules, price of drugs are going to go down, more people are going to use drugs than would use them, and there are problems that are associated with that. What I will say is, though, you'll see a drop in gangs, people won't have the incentive to join gangs, and you won't have the gang violence that you would have otherwise had. There are different ways that people measure murder rates, particularly when you get older murder rate data. But I think the best estimates indicate that the highest murder rate that we ever had in the United States was 1932. That's the last year of prohibition in the United States. Within 2 years after prohibition had ended, the murder rate in the United States had fallen by about 60%. And so, there are lots of things that one can do. I think, but I think that would probably be something that we would notice if we had those types of changes. And I just mentioned one other thing. We had a big drop in murder rates during the 1990s. And one thing that happened was at the end of the Bush 1 administration, the beginning of the Clinton administration, they really cut back. Clinton pretty much ended the military's involvement in drug interdiction. Prior to that, it's basically only the large cartels that could go and bring illegal drugs to the United States. They only really had the resources to kind of get by as a military in any large amounts. So you had relatively few sources of illegal drugs. Prices were high, but they got a lot of profit. But the high profits meant that there was big incentives for them to go and fight against each other in order to try to control drug territory in the United States. When you had more sources of drugs coming in, not only did the prices fall, but the profits from selling them went down. And they didn't have the same incentives to go and fight against each other. One of the reasons why New York had such a large drop in murder rates during the 1990s, part of it was Giuliani increased the police force by 50%. That was very important. But the other thing that happened was New York City had been plagued by drug crime even more than many other cities had been. And so when you had the liberalization of these rules and enforcement, New York City saw a bigger drop than a lot of the other places. But there are other things that can be done. One of the things that concerns me is making sure that people who are most vulnerable to crime, the most likely victims, are able to go and defend themselves. And so things that are involved with there, I'm very concerned about the state laws that are getting passed right now that make it very costly for people who own guns. In Maryland, it's going to be $350 to license and register a handgun in the state. Who can afford those types of fees? It's not poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas like Baltimore who are going to pay those fees to legally own a handgun that's there, right? It's basically going to be well-to-do whites. The people who are most likely to be victims of crime are going to be priced out of being able to own guns for protection because of those types of things. Also, I'd like to see getting rid of these kind of gun-free zones that we have. So, that covers a range of types of things that I hope respond to this question. Yes.
Thank you for coming and sharing with us. Appreciate it. I'm a pharmacist. I've been a pharmacist for 4 years. I have a question. Do you know why pro-gun advocates are not reflecting gun-related issues to the incidents of SSRI homicides and suicides related to, in this country? There's a website, ssristories.com. There's over 4,800 stories of people that have either committed murder, suicide, whatever, either because they were on SSRI, psychotropic drugs, or were withdrawn from them and reactions to it. Over 200,000 people a year are admitted to hospital with mania and psychosis related to those drugs. And I don't hear anything in the news media about that. And it seems to me if you're a pro-gun advocate, you're going to want to focus on some of the causes, not just, the gun issues themselves. But do you have any feedback on that?
I mean, there's some people who look at those types of things. Maybe an area for people really have done it. I don't really try to look a lot at anecdotal stories. Most of the website that you're pointing to, it sounds interesting. They motivate somebody to go and try to do it. What you really need, maybe you know this, but does the issuance of those types of drugs vary a lot across the country? Has it changed in different parts of the country differently at different times than it has in other places?
Well, in many of the instances that, either, in the Virginia shooting and that.
Right,
in Columbine, all those people were.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Backing up with that.
Right,
That's never brought up.
Right. Well, I mean, some people brought this up, but here's the point, and that is, if you want to study it empirically, which is what I try to do, you want to, one nice thing about the United States is we have 51 different laboratories. Different states adopt different laws in different years, so you can kind of see, you can try to disentangle, because you have all these different experiments that are going on, different things that are going on. And the reason why I was asking you the question is that, let's say, certain states legalize that type of drug relative to others, or made it illegal, or had it regulated in different ways, or it was introduced in certain places at different times. That allows you to start to do some empirical work. But if it's basically something that was used in the whole United States simultaneously at the same time, or allowed to be used, it makes it much harder to kind of disentangle the different things that are going on. So I'm not saying it's wrong.
Right. And I'm not disputing, I'm all in favor of what you're saying in terms of right to carry. I just say, when you look at statistics, there's a lot of factors in it, and you can, depending upon what you want to prove, you can look at these factors or these factors, but I think it's a huge factor in what's going on.
Yeah, look, I'm not arguing with you.
No,
one of the things that we do in these empirical studies is we use what are called year fixed effects, which essentially take out kind of the national, regional trends that we have in the primary. So did violent crime murders fall from 2007 to 2008? And did they fall more in, let's say, states that adopted right to carry laws or some other type of law? And so, but you want to pull out the average. And so what I'm saying is, the type of thing that you're talking about, if in fact it's affecting the whole country at the same time, is already in some sense being controlled for, at least in the simple, in these types of aggression. And now, that doesn't mean one can't try to do more on that. But if it's just a national variable, it's going to be taken out by these national fixed effects that are there. So, but it could be something important, and if you want to talk to me afterwards, so I get some idea maybe how the issuance of this may have changed across different states at different times, then it might be possible to do some empirical work.
Can you make a comment on the possibility of armed citizens using their guns to defend themselves against the government?
Look,
This needs to be the last question.
right. But I don't want, let me just make a message to that. Look, I try to deal with things that I can measure. I understand the Second Amendment and the motivation for a lot of people doing it. In freedom and other things are very important. I'm not trying to take it away. What motivated me to get involved in doing this type of research to begin with was that the safety issue and crime and suicides and other things like that. And those are things I can relatively easily measure. And so, and the nice thing about the United States is that you have all these states that we can compare relatively easily. It's not like some states become totalitarian or had dictators and others haven't at different times. So it's interesting to look at. Since we're limited, how many questions? Somebody said one more question. Okay. Well, I want to ask
Keep it brief, one more.
question.
I guess we have a question. One of the.
Let's ask a hot, do you guys have a question back?
Just back there.
Yeah, I just want to have sympathetic questions. So, let me address one thing that one of the women in the back said there. You were talking about you didn't want to own a gun in the home. You implied about the risks of having guns in the home. You know, there's a series of public health studies that have been out that people often point to. It says the risk of having a gun in the home, you know, from you killing yourself or somebody else is much higher than going and killing an intruder that's going to come in the home. I'm sure we've all heard these types of things, but 22 times higher than the first study. I think it's just important to talk about this for a second, because the type of thing that you raise in your brief comment is something that I think concerns people. We hear it all the time. And here's just to understand the study, basically a series of studies done by a guy named Arthur Kellerman, who was then at Emory. What they look at people who died in a city, in or near a residence over the course of a year or a couple of years. And they'll ask the relatives of the deceased whether a gun was owned in the home. And they'll assume if you died from a gunshot and a gun was owned in the home, that it was that gun that was used in the death. When people have gone back and looked at that data, what they found is that virtually all those deaths were actually due to a weapon being brought in from the outside. So the very first of their studies, where they looked at 444 homicides, they assumed all those homicides were due to the gun that was in the home. In fact, it turns out only 8 of those were. The other 436 were from a weapon that was brought in from the outside. There's two other problems I'll just mention briefly. One is, the comparison is somebody dying in the home from a gunshot versus you killing the intruder. The thing is, when people use guns defensively, killing the intruder is very rare. Only about 1 out of every 1,000 times that people use a gun defensively is the intruder killed. But that doesn't mean that's the only benefit. You know, even if you include woundings are 7 or 8 times more frequent than killing somebody. But they're still just a tiny fraction of 1%. The rest of the time, when you brandish or fire a warning shot, and you cause the criminal to break off an attack, those are benefits too. You know, you stop the crime and you give them 0 weight. Just fixing that would also reverse the result. Either one of those changes by themselves would actually flip the results and cause them to be the other way. But there's an even more important problem, and it's a theoretical problem. And that is, so we go and take these people who died in or near a residence, find out, ask the relatives whether they own a gun. And then they take a control group. People who are the same age, sex, and race, and live within a mile of the deceased, and ask them whether they own a gun. And then they run a regression on whether you died, on whether or not you owned a gun. And they find a positive relationship. Well, let's use that same methodology to study something like hospitals. So we go and we look at people who die in the city over the course of a year, and we ask their relatives whether they've been to a hospital. And then we find people who are the same age, sex, and race who live within a mile of the deceased, and ask them whether they've been to the hospital, but they're still alive. And then we run a regression on whether you die, on whether you've been to a hospital. What do you think you're going to find? My guess is, do you understand? Yeah, my guess is you're going to find a very strong relationship. But the problem is, I'm sure you know, is that we wouldn't go to the government lobby and get rid of hospitals, because that's not a very good test, right? Because we don't want to compare, there's a reason why the live guy didn't go to the hospital, because he was healthy. There's a reason why the sick person went to the hospital, because he was sick. We don't want to compare the life expectancy with a healthy person with a sick person, right? We want to look at 2 sick people. And there's ways that economists can go and deal with that type of thing. But the point is that you're mixing up 2 groups that you shouldn't be mixing up. So in the case of guns, for example, some of the people being studied were gang members in these studies. You know, maybe they were high-risk individuals to begin with because they were members of a gang. Or maybe somebody owned a gun because they had been robbed before, or they had some other reason for believing that they were more at risk. Maybe they would have been even more at risk if they didn't own a gun and they felt at risk to begin with. But you somehow have to control for whether you're looking at 2 people who are equally sick or comparing a healthy person versus a sick person. as well as the reason why different people own guns to begin with. And those types of studies don't break those types of things out. And I think when you do, not just controlling for the data errors, but even more, you find results that show the opposite thing. And since you brought that up, and I think it's an important point, I just wanted to respond to that. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say that, I'm not very critical about it. I was actually upstairs at the meeting and the organization that we're part of called the Creative Project. The Creative Arts Project.
Oh, okay.
We've all worked with people who are incarcerated, who
Right.
are related to violence, related to drugs, etc. My father works in the FBI and my son had a gun my whole life. That's when I felt safer. I think I brought up the same neighborhood because of compliment in my face, etc. So I think that you're showing a lot of data and you're not talking about structural systems in our society that are making a difference. I don't think that increasing guns for a neighborhood will increase crime. It's something that is, and I also think it's really inappropriate when there's been like laughter and discourse about violence and stuff. I think it's really interesting. I would really like to.
Well, thank you for that.
Can't fix stupid.
Your feelings are not a concern.
I agree with that.